I want you to imagine something. Not a battlefield explosion, not a missile streaking across a night sky. I want you to imagine silence. The silence of an artillery battery that has fired its last shell and has nothing left to load. The silence of an F-35 cockpit where the fuel gauge reads empty and the resupply that was supposed to arrive yesterday and the day before that has still not come. The silence of 120,000 soldiers sitting in defensive positions across 5 operational sectors, looking at ration supplies that ran out this morning, waiting for orders that cannot be executed because the fuel to move the vehicles does not exist, the ammunition to support the advance has not arrived, and the command infrastructure that would coordinate the operation was destroyed 3 days ago. I have spent 3 decades studying how armies die. Not in the dramatic sense, not the last stand, not the decisive battle, not the moment of heroic defeat that gets written into military history. I mean, the quiet, grinding, logistical death that happens when the supply chain that keeps a modern army alive is systematically severed at every node simultaneously, and the organization begins consuming itself from the inside out. In 40 years of military analysis, I have never seen a supply chain interdiction campaign executed with the speed, the precision, and the strategic comprehensiveness that Iran has just demonstrated against the IDF. What happened in the past 5 days was not a military engagement. It was a controlled demolition of an army's ability to exist as a fighting force, conducted not with a sledgehammer, but with a scalpel, and completed in a time frame that no Western planning model had assessed as operationally achievable. 5 days. That is how long it took. 5 days from the opening strike against Israel's primary logistics nodes to the operational paralysis of 120,000 deployed troops across every active front. 5 days from the first caliber impact on the Ashdod port fuel terminal to the moment when IDF Northern Command issued the internal assessment that sustained offensive operations were no longer supportable at current supply levels. 5 days from the most ambitious supply chain interdiction campaign in the history of modern warfare to the collapse of the military architecture that the United States and Israel spent 50 years and hundreds of billions of dollars constructing. The world is still processing what happened. Washington is still in the assessment phase, still running the damage numbers, still trying to construct a coherent response to a strategic situation that none of its planning assumptions had prepared it for. But the reality on the ground does not wait for Washington's assessment to be complete. 120,000 Israeli soldiers are sitting in positions they cannot advance from, cannot be resupplied to, and cannot be extracted from without confronting the same interdiction threat that severed their supply lines in the first place. That is not a tactical problem. That is a strategic verdict. And understanding exactly how Iran delivered that verdict, with what weapons, through what operational logic, and toward what ultimate strategic objective is what this analysis is here to do. In the next 40 minutes, we are going to answer the questions that matter. How did Iran identify, target, and destroy 90% of IDF supply routes in a single coordinated operational campaign? And what does the specific sequencing of that campaign reveal about the depth of Iranian strategic planning? What does it actually mean for 120,000 soldiers when their supply chain collapses? The fuel mathematics, the ammunition arithmetic, the food timeline. And at what point does supply chain degradation translate into military incapacity that no amount of tactical skill can overcome? Why was the United States unable to execute the emergency resupply operation that Israel's survival required? And what does that inability reveal about the true limits of American power projection in a contested logistics environment? And when an army of 120,000 has been starved into operational paralysis in 5 days, what comes next? Who holds the initiative? And what does the Middle East look like on the other side of this collapse? If this level of strategic analysis is what you have been looking for, the kind that goes past the headline and into the operational reality that determines outcomes, Subscribe now and stay with me through this breakdown. Hit like, share this with anyone who is genuinely trying to understand what is happening in this conflict, and leave your assessment in the comments below. I read every one. Now let us get into the full analysis. The operational architecture of Iran's supply interdiction campaign was not improvised. It was the product of years of systematic intelligence collection, target development, and operational planning executed across 5 distinct phases that each addressed a specific layer of the IDF logistics system, in a sequencing designed to ensure that the destruction of each layer prevented the surviving layers from compensating. Understanding why this campaign worked requires first understanding what a modern army's supply chain actually looks like, because the popular image of military logistics as trucks driving to the front with boxes of ammunition is approximately as accurate as describing a modern jet fighter as a flying machine with guns. The IDF's supply architecture is a complex, interdependent system with multiple nodes, multiple pathways, and multiple redundancies specifically designed to survive disruption at any individual point. Iran's operational planners understood this architecture in detail, understood where the redundancies existed, and more importantly, understood that simultaneous attack across all redundant pathways simultaneously eliminates the redundancy advantage entirely. Phase 1 Maritime Interdiction, hours 0 to 6. The campaign opened at 2:40 a.m. on day 1 with simultaneous strikes against Israel's 3 functioning port facilities. Ashdod, the primary military import terminal handling approximately 55% of IDF equipment and munitions imports by sea, absorbed 34 caliber impacts in a strike package lasting 28 minutes. The targeting within Ashdod was specific to military logistics function. The container handling cranes serving the military cargo terminal were each struck individually. The fuel offloading pier was destroyed in a sequencing pattern that ensured complete structural collapse rather than repairable damage, and the bonded military warehouse complex received penetrating warhead impacts designed to achieve internal detonation of stored munitions, rather than simply collapsing the external structure. Haifa, the northern port that serves as the primary logistics gateway for forces deployed on the northern front, absorbed 41 strikes with a targeting focus on its military fuel terminal and the rail connection that links the port to the forward logistics base network. Eilat, the Red Sea port that represents Israel's only non-Mediterranean maritime import pathway, was struck by 18 weapons that destroyed its container handling infrastructure and the road and rail connections linking it to the rest of the country. In 6 hours, 90% of Israel's maritime import capacity was eliminated. The IDF's logistics system, which depends on continuous seaborne resupply to replenish the consumables, fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts that sustain combat operations, burn through at rates that no domestic stockpile can cover indefinitely, had lost its primary replenishment pathway before sunrise on day 1. Phase 2 road and rail interdiction, hours 6 to 18. The second phase targeted the overland logistics network that connects Israel's surviving stockpile locations to its forward deployed forces. 12 major road bridge crossings on the primary logistics routes between the central stockpile complex and the northern and southern operational fronts were struck by precision weapons that achieved structural collapse at the bridge deck. Level, not damage, requiring repair, but destruction requiring complete reconstruction. The rail lines serving the northern logistics corridor were struck at 9 separate points, each chosen to maximize the length of track rendered unusable by a single impact. This phase reflected a targeting logic that I find particularly sophisticated from a professional standpoint. Rather than attacking vehicles on the road, a tactic that is operationally costly and produces only temporary disruption, Iran's planners attacked the infrastructure that the vehicles must use. A destroyed bridge cannot be bypassed by a different route when every bridge on every alternate route has also been destroyed. The IDF's overland logistics capability was not degraded, it was structurally eliminated. Phase 3 forward depot destruction, hours 18 to 36, with maritime and overland resupply pathways severed. Phase 3 targeted the forward logistics depots that represent the IDF's organic supply buffer, the stockpiles maintained in theater to sustain operations for a defined period without resupply. These facilities are hardened, dispersed, and their locations are among the most closely held operational security secrets in the IDF system. The fact that Iranian targeting databases included accurate location data for the majority of these facilities is itself a significant intelligence finding whose implications extend well beyond the immediate tactical situation. 11 of Israel's 14 identified forward logistics depots were struck in Phase 3. The 3 that survived did so because they were located within urban areas where the collateral damage calculus constrained the strike package, a constraint that Iran's operational planners appear to have consciously incorporated into their targeting decisions. The surviving depot inventory, assessed at approximately 15% of pre-campaign forward stockpile levels, represented supply availability of between 3 and 7 days at current consumption rates for the forces. Depending on them, Phase 4 air logistics interdiction, hours 36 to 48. Phase 4 addressed the emergency resupply pathway that American and Israeli planners had identified as the primary compensating mechanism for maritime and overland interdiction air logistics. The runways at Ben Gurion International Airport, which serves as the primary entry point for air-delivered military cargo, were struck at 6 separate points with weapons carrying penetrating warheads designed to produce subsurface detonations that create craters resistant to emergency repair. Ramon Airport in the south, the secondary air logistics facility, was struck simultaneously. The military airfields at Nevatim and Tel Nof, which have the runway capacity to handle heavy cargo aircraft, had already been rendered non-operational in the preceding caliber strikes on IDF bases. By the end of Phase 4, Israel had no functional air cargo terminal capable of receiving the heavy lift aircraft that emergency military resupply requires. The air bridge that Washington needed to execute emergency resupply did not exist. Phase 5 continuous pressure days 2 through 5. Phase 5 was not a discrete operational action, but a sustained campaign of targeted strikes against repair attempts, emergency logistics improvisations, and any emerging alternative supply pathway. When Israeli engineering units attempted emergency bridge repair on 2 of the destroyed road crossings, follow-on strikes destroyed the repair equipment and the partially completed work. When commercial vessels attempted to approach Ashdod to offload emergency supplies through improvised transfer arrangements, naval interdiction assets made clear that the approach was not viable. The message of Phase 5 was consistent and unambiguous. The supply chain interdiction was not a one-time event. It was a sustained operational condition that would be enforced until the strategic objectives that motivated it were achieved. What concerns me most in analyzing the post-interdiction supply situation is not the dramatic imagery of empty ammunition crates or grounded aircraft. It is the cold arithmetic of consumption rates versus remaining inventory applied across 120,000 deployed personnel in active combat conditions. That arithmetic tells a story that is more unforgiving than any battlefield narrative. An IDF armored brigade in active operations consumes approximately 180,000 liters of diesel fuel per day across all its organic vehicles, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, artillery tractors, engineering equipment, logistics trucks. Israel has approximately 8 armored brigades currently deployed in operational configurations. At that consumption rate, the fuel inventory surviving the Phase 1 and Phase 3 strikes, estimated at approximately 40% of pre-campaign levels, represented between 4 and 6 days of operational consumption. By day 5 of the interdiction campaign, fuel availability had fallen below the minimum threshold required to sustain offensive operations. armored vehicles began being immobilized not by enemy action but by empty fuel tanks. Aviation fuel presents an even more acute constraint. IDF air operations consume approximately 2.4 million liters of aviation fuel daily at current sortie rates. The surviving aviation fuel inventory after the port strikes and depot destruction was assessed at approximately 8 days of consumption. By day 5, sortie rates had been reduced by over 60% as fuel conservation protocols were implemented. The F-35S, that represent Israel's most capable strike platform, the aircraft that the IDF depends on for the deep strike missions that are central to its operational doctrine, were being flown at a fraction of their operational tempo, their missions rationed against a fuel supply that was visibly counting down to zero. Ammunition consumption in sustained combat operations is enormous in ways that peacetime planning sometimes underestimates. An Israeli artillery battalion firing at standard sustained fire rates expends approximately 800 rounds per day. Multiply that across the artillery systems deployed across 5 active fronts. Add the consumption of tank, main gun ammunition, mortar rounds, anti-tank missiles, and the precision-guided munitions that modern combat operations depend on, and the daily ammunition consumption figure for the IDF in its current operational posture runs to thousands of tons. The surviving forward depot inventory after Phase 3 represented approximately 5 days of consumption at reduced operational tempo. By day 5, multiple artillery units had reported exhaustion of available ammunition stocks and cessation of fire missions. Food is the variable that most directly affects the human dimension of this collapse. Military ration supply for 120,000 personnel requires approximately 360 tons of food daily, a logistical requirement that seems manageable in isolation, but becomes acute when the distribution infrastructure has been destroyed and forward units are dependent on what they carried with them. IDF doctrine calls for forward units to carry 3 days of organic ration supply. By day 4, units in the most forward positions were reporting consumption of emergency ration reserves that are intended to be held for genuine last resort situations. By day 5, the operational picture across multiple sectors included the words that no military commander ever wants to write in an operational assessment. Personnel combat effectiveness degraded by nutritional insufficiency. The medical logistics dimension adds a further layer of acute concern. Field surgical units, trauma treatment facilities, and casualty evacuation systems all depend on continuous resupply of consumable medical materials, blood products, surgical supplies, pharmaceutical inventories that have very limited organic carrying capacity. By day 3, multiple field medical facilities were operating on reduced capacity due to consumable shortages. By day 5, the medical logistics situation had become a direct constraint on operational decision-making, as commanders factored casualty treatment capacity into their assessment of which operations could be sustained. I want to be direct about something that the American media coverage of this situation has consistently avoided, stating plainly, the United States was unable to execute the emergency resupply operation that Israel required. And the reasons for that failure are structural rather than political. This is not a story about a lack of will in Washington. It is a story about the physical and operational limits of what American military logistics can accomplish when the receiving end of the resupply pipeline has been systematically destroyed. The emergency resupply planning that began in Washington within hours of the Phase 1 strikes confronted 3 sequential problems that compounded into an insurmountable operational constraint. The first problem was throughput capacity. American C-17 and C-5 heavy lift aircraft can each carry approximately 70 to 80 tons of cargo per flight. Israel's military fuel requirement alone, 2.4 million liters of aviation fuel, daily translates to approximately 2,000 tons of fuel that must be delivered every day simply to maintain current reduced sortie rates. at 75 tons per C, 17 sortie. That fuel requirement alone demands 27 heavy lift sorties per day before accounting for ammunition, food, medical supplies, and spare parts. The entire USAF fleet of C-17S numbers, approximately 220 aircraft, not all of which are available for any single operation. The airlift throughput required to compensate for the loss of maritime logistics is physically beyond what available American heavy lift assets can provide. The second problem was the receiving infrastructure. The Phase 4 strikes that destroyed Ben Gurion's runway systems eliminated the primary entry point for air-delivered cargo. Ramon Airport, the secondary facility, was similarly non-functional. The military airfields with adequate cargo handling capacity were destroyed in the earlier base strikes. American military engineers can repair cratered runways, but not in the time frame relevant to an acute supply crisis, and not while the repair operation itself is subject to follow-on strikes against the repair equipment and personnel. The third problem was the threat environment. American C-17S delivering emergency supplies are large, slow, radar-conspicuous aircraft that require permissive airspace to operate safely. The same Iranian air defense and strike assets that executed the supply interdiction campaign have demonstrated both the capability and the will